Okay, hello everyone. Sorry for the raspy voice. Welcome to MCLA and to tonight's Green Living Seminar presentation. I'm Elena Traister in the Environmental Studies Department. This semester's Green Living Seminar is organized around the theme of sustainable food and farming. All presentations are free and open to the public. They take place on Thursdays at 5:30 here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, room 121. Today's presentation will last about 40 minutes or so with an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And a quick announcement for next week's presentation. On Thursday, February 21st, Lydia Sisson, co-founder of Mill City Grows, will present a lecture titled Farming in the City. Today's presentation on advancing a shared food vision will be given by Julia Friedgood, Assistant Vice President of Programs for American Farmland Trust. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Elena. Can everybody hear me okay? So I'm Julia Friedgood, and I'm here kind of wearing dual hats, which you'll hear about a little bit. So I am with American Farmland Trust, and I'm also wearing the hat of a network member of Food Solutions New England, which advanced the New England Food Vision. So out of curiosity, has anybody even heard of the New England Food Vision? Two people? Okay, great. So I'll give a pretty high-level explanation of what that's all about, but I'll also give some context about sort of what brings us from American Farmland Trust to working on something like a shared New England food vision. So American Farmland Trust is a national nonprofit organization whose mission is to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land, which sort of broadly defined is land use, good environmental stewardship of agricultural land, and what I would broadly call ag viability, or making it possible for farmers to earn a living on the land. And increasingly that becomes one of the challenges even to keeping farmland in farming. So how many people have ever heard of American Farmland Trust? Oh, a few more. I put this up because sometimes I just carry the bumper sticker. Most people have seen our bumper stickers around, or the sort of response to our bumper sticker, yes farms, yes food. But a lot of people don't actually know who AFT is. So I figured, you might as well know us by what we're best known for, which is our slogan, no farms, no food. The other thing that sort of brings me to the table beyond AFT's sort of broad mission around healthy and sustainable agriculture leading to healthy and sustainable food is a 5-year project I was involved with called Growing Food Connections. And the goal of that was to enhance community food security and agricultural viability at the local level. So some people might think that's about local food, but it's really about local farms and local communities, and food very much is intrinsic to that being a healthy relationship, but it doesn't preclude those of us who like to drink coffee in the morning. The strategy was really to build local government support to advance food systems, because one of the things that I have a planning degree, so I didn't give all my pedigree or anything, but I have a planning degree, and most planners focus on urban, or they focus on sort of regional planning, and most planners don't plan for farms. But farms are actually, to some people maybe part of the problem, but to me, very much part of the solution to a lot of the things that planners work on. And so building capacity for planners to address food and agriculture in their communities, to address food security and insecurity, to address the environmental consequences of different kinds of farming, to address the economics of farming all seems really important. And this project really advanced that in a meaningful way between doing national surveys about what planners were doing in the space, really diving deep into what local policies were, whether they're urban ag policies or rural ag policies or policies that kind of one hopes bridge the divide between urban and rural in this country. We did a lot of case studies. We started out calling them best practices and then decided to call them promising practices because one thing doesn't necessarily translate to another. And so what we were looking for were really exemplary examples of what people had done so other people could learn and mimic it. And then a large part of my role in this project, which was a bit of an octopus of a project, was to work with 8 communities across the country to sort of build capacity to advance this work on the ground in real places from southern New Mexico all the way to Maine. And then out of that, because I was also working with academics at University of Buffalo, Ohio State University, we did journal articles and actually published a whole journal coming out of the project, and so did a lot of academic research as well. This is really just for anybody who's interested in that line of work. Go to growingfoodconnections.org. There are tons and tons of resources. One of the things I did was a guide to help communities advance this, so it has a lot on what kind of local policies can be used. And that sort of leads me to this work. So AFT, as an organization, had been involved very early with developing the New England Food Vision. I came at it more like 2 years ago. And I really came to it a lot because I love this quote that food has the power to transform economies and drive positive change. So what future do you want to see? Food is one of the ways to get there. So a lot of the work that I've done personally, and I would say that AFT more organizationally has done, has been really leading to this. We come at from what I would call the sustainable agriculture point of view, but it's all to really create healthier communities. The food vision came out of an effort of multiple stakeholders, and especially somebody named Brian Donahue, but other academics as well, to really try to figure out where we were in New England as a region, a 6-state region, and also where we could go that would foster a lot of community values as well as increasing the supply of food to 50% of our food coming from the region by 2060. And that effort now is being sort of propelled by a group that I'm a network member of, so that's my other jester hat, Food Solutions New England, which is a regional collaborative network. And it's organized to support the emergence and continued viability of the New England food system. It's a resilient driver of healthy food for all, so that's really wide food access, racial equity, sustainable farming and fishing, and thriving communities. I'm not a fisheries expert, so I'm going to focus today much more on the agricultural side of the equation. For us, we look at, for us at AFT, so the food vision is to 2060. Actually, a lot of the work I've been doing at AFT is really looking at 2040, but for now, I'm going to talk about 2060 because I'm wearing the Food Solutions New England hat. There'll be 10 billion people projected to be on the planet, 400 million in the US and 17 million in New England. It's going to take a lot to actually make sure that we're growing food sustainably for that many people. And the systems we have in place today, I don't think actually are quite geared to doing that in a both sustainable and resilient way. But I think they could, and I think that's really important. And I think that if we think about how to do this in a way that really has positive impacts for the environment, as well as for people's diets, as well as people's quality of life in their communities, as well as for racial justice issues, I think it's a really powerful proposition, and personally, I think it's something we all should be working on together. So what would it look like if farming and fishing were healing forces here in the region, and the region maybe as an example for the rest of the country? But also, how are we going to get there? And I spend a lot of my time dealing with sort of where we are right now. And where we are right now nationally, as well as in the region, is that our agriculture and our agricultural land base are threatened by some pretty deep and potentially insidious national trends, and they include really a weakened farm economy, except for a very, very small handful of players, aging farmers and farmland owners, and that's true in rural communities as well as in agriculture. But in agriculture, if you think of it as an industry, the age of people is much higher than in other industries. On the other side of the equation is a pretty rapid decline of new and beginning farmers and young farmers. And then AFT's sort of bailiwick, which is addressing urbanization and increasingly rural sprawl, low-density development into rural communities. And then the one sort of thing that we all have to deal with, which is climate change. So for the economics, just thinking about the economics of agriculture in general, there's been tremendous consolidation, and it mostly happened in the 20th century, but it's continuing to happen in this century as well. The number of farms dropped more than 60%, actually. Farm size grew 67%. Wealth is concentrated in a very few hands. 3% of the largest farms account for 42% of farm production. About 50% of the production is really controlled by about 3%, like broadly speaking, especially when you're looking at corn and soybeans in the Midwest. And then half of all farm production value comes from farms that are grossing more than $1 million a year. And the farms that are growing the most and claiming the greatest share of the economy are those that are making more than $5 million a year, which wasn't even recorded 10 years ago. So that's a real shift. I think it's a real shift in our economy in general, but it has a very dire effect on agriculture since the majority of farms in this country are small farms. And so they're struggling more and more to stay in business, and even the mid-sized commercial farms that people sort of think of maybe most romantically as the family farm are also being squeezed out by this sort of bifurcation where there are a few very large farms that control most of the money and then a lot of smaller farms that have very little share of the pie. So what I find most concerning really is that this statistic that only 20% of U.S. farms make a profit higher than a family of four, poverty line for a family of four. And that's true in New England as well. And in fact, New England, it's a little bit more dire, that about 2/3 of the farms had net losses in 2012. So one thing I will note is that we're all waiting desperately for the new Census of Agriculture, which was due out this month. But because of the government shutdown, we have to wait at least until April. So I am giving you old data, and it's data that I hope that if I ever speak to you again will be updated in the next 3 months, because for those of us who are a little bit of data geeks, we desperately want it, and we want to see if anything shifted. But as of the last ag census, 65% of New England's farms were losing money, and more than half of the nation's farms. And that average farm income in the region was only about $10,000 a year, versus almost $44,000 in the rest of the country. So that, if we really want to grow agriculture and grow the food that we grow in the region, people have got to be able to earn a living. The other big piece that I spend a lot of my time working on is the transition or the succession of farmland in the country. If you look at the people who own farmland, so those would be senior principal operators, so the sort of the main person who reports on the census, if you will, and then senior principal landlords. And about half of the people who own farmland in this country are farmers, and the other half are agricultural landlords. There are about 2 million of each group. If you put them all together, more than 40% of our farmland is owned by people age 65 and older, which for most industries would be retirement age. Not so much in agriculture because people don't seem to be retiring, but that's probably because they can't really afford to retire. But it does suggest that there's a huge transition of land and wealth that's going to happen, if not in the next 10, in the next 20 or 25 years. And then the farming population itself is graying much faster than the rest of the population. And so rather than read you all kinds of statistics, just look at the gray bars between 1982 and 2012. And the gray has gotten much bigger, and the green at the bottom has gotten much smaller. And that's the general trend. The proportion of the senior principals increased 86% in 20 years, in a generation. So that's a big shift, and it's because it's hard for beginners to get in. New England shares these trends, and so this is work that came out of a project we did called Gaining Insights, Gaining Access, about sort of who owns farmland in New England. and what's going to happen to that farmland. And we actually, in that project, usually people define young farmers as farmers under the age of 35. We decided that it was more realistic to define young farmers as under the age of 45. So we were looking at where you had senior operators over the age of 65 who did not have somebody under the age of 45 farming with them. So they might have had somebody else farming with them. It may be their wife who was 64, or maybe even a child who was in their 50s. But for somebody younger who would give you sort of a longer sense of where that land would transition, what we found was 92% of the people who own farms in the region and are over the age of 65 do not have a younger operator farming along with them. Now, since we have always believed in agriculture that the way land passes is through cradle, altar, or grave, if they don't have somebody somewhat younger farming with them, that doesn't bode well for what's going to happen in that transition. And meanwhile, nationally, the ranks of young and beginning farmers has been shrinking. So where the seniors went up 86%, the juniors and the new farmers went down 66% in that same period. And just from 2007 to 2012, the number of beginners dropped 20%. Now, that was the Great Recession, and so again, I'm very optimistic that when we see the new census, that may have shifted some. But 20% is a pretty big drop. And so even if we turn it around, it's going to take a while to be going in the other direction. Here in New England, the outlook actually is a little bit more hopeful. There are more people getting into agriculture. And even some young people are getting into agriculture, which is really good. And if you look at the trends of young farmers, you'll see that it was pretty stable between 2002 and 2007, which is somewhat different than national. And certainly from 2002, it was not such a precipitous drop. And what you also see is that there's sort of a larger share of beginners in New England, 23% in New England versus 18% nationally. So that, to me, is very hopeful in the region. But there are barriers to entry. And so the blue report on the right is something that I worked on a few years ago, where we were really trying to figure out, well, what is the issue? And not only what are the challenges, but what are beginners doing to succeed? What does it take to help the next generation? And coming out of that, what we found was that there actually were a lot of resources to help with business development and planning, actually financial resources, even though access to credit and financing is a barrier, a lot on marketing and certainly on production. But finding land, which is one of the number one challenges that beginners face, there was really very little infrastructure in place to support them. So that's one of the things that AFT has really taken on in the last few years, is to try to kind of build a network of support across the country to support beginners, finding land that's appropriate for the kind of agriculture that they want to practice, and then securing land tenure. But one of the reasons that it's hard to find land is that we're gobbling it up. And so another project that I'm involved with is called, well, we were calling it State of America's Farmland. Now it's called Farms Under Threat. And we did a national scope of where development was occurring on high-quality farmland, on farmland in general, but especially on high-quality farmland, where we not only looked at urbanization, which is what most people have looked at in the past, but we also looked at what we would call fragmentation or low-density rural development and housing sort of being spread out across the rural landscape. And what we found was that second piece was really insidious. There have been, since the mid-1990s, there have been a lot of efforts to kind of do urban infill and do a lot more sort of sustainable urban development, but people have really neglected rural and not paid attention to it. And as a result, there's just sort of scattered development all across the landscape. And so we found nearly twice as much development that had been reported before, 31 million acres between 1992 and 2012. And I don't know, does anybody know like how big an acre is? I mean, it's basically the size of a football field without the end zones, right? So 31 million acres, in a landscape of what appears to be about 1 billion acres managed by farmers and ranchers may not seem like a lot. But it's like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, or it's like the state of New York. So for those of us who are coming from smaller states, it's actually a really, really significant impact on the landscape. And it comes down to about 3 acres a minute. We are now waiting for all this new data and updating it, and we're going to be updating our studies to 2017. And we're going to be doing very specific in-state analyses, which will contribute both to the food vision work, but also to AFT's work. So if you talk to me in a year, I'll be able to tell you much more about what's happening right here in Massachusetts. But one reason we should care about that development is because it's consuming the land that we grow our food, and especially the food that we eat. So that's fruits and vegetables and dairy, eggs, and poultry. It's not as much consuming the land we use to feed livestock, which is most of what our agriculture is used for. So 60% of ag land in the U.S. is used to grow corn and soybeans, primarily for livestock feed and ethanol, and so sort of indirectly maybe as part of our food system, but certainly we're not out there eating grain for cows. But the food that we really eat is mostly coming from metro or adjacent counties, so more than 60% of it. And 81% of what you might call local food or food that's sold directly to consumers is coming. And so that's the land that's being eaten up the fastest and first. So just looking at sort of the impact of that on potentially on New England, these are just a lot of graphs. I'm not going to read the numbers, but the sort of message of all of it is direct marketing is incredibly important in this region. This region leads the nation in that kind of agriculture. And so making sure that we have an adequate land base both for beginners to get into agriculture and also to grow the food that we want to eat is really, really important in this region. And then finally, in terms of sort of big national things that are going to have a major impact on our agriculture here in the region as well as nationally, as well as globally, is climate change. And that is expected to have a very significant effect on farm and food production. And in our Farms Under Threat work, once we finish what we call the State of the States analyses, we're going to be doing projective analyses looking at the impact of development going forward in different scenarios and also of climate change. So we'll be learning a lot more about that in the next couple of years. New England is bucking some of these trends. Our farms, the number of farms is growing. They tend to be very small farms, and so their economic viability is at risk, but it's really great to see that the number is increasing. The number of acres is increasing, especially in things like vegetables and melons. And more farmland is being used for crops that we eat, so for direct marketing. For those of you who are familiar with Hadley or whatever, we used to grow a lot of tobacco and had a lot more hay, and a lot of that has been actually transferred to higher value crops that are things that we're eating. And so again, as we think about a food vision and getting 50 by 60, there are signs that we're moving in the right direction. It's just not as easy as sort of clicking our heels together and hoping that we're in Kansas. But New England farmers benefit from a lot of consumer report. That's certainly true here in the Valley, but I think it's true across the region, and that's something that we can build on as we think about how we're going to achieve a very ambitious New England food vision. So for people who haven't seen the report, that is the cover of the report, and I did bring a copy. If anybody wants to look at it afterwards, you're welcome to. It's also available on the web. It's now, a few years old, and what happened was coming out of the food vision itself, the Food Solutions New England network kind of organized in order to move forward some of the things that were found in the vision. And so, there's the 50 by 60 goal that I mentioned before, but the idea is to do that through sustainable farming and fishing, making sure that we really are providing healthy food for everybody, including low-income residents across the region. Racial equity and food justice, which is tied to food security, but it's also tied to who can enter farmland and enter farming and gain access to land, and thriving healthy communities. To get there, the authors did a lot of research on sort of carrying capacity and what was possible to do in the region, and called for dietary adjustments. and they probably will sound familiar because many of you probably heard the similar things from your doctors, but, fewer cheap carbs, healthier fats, less red meat, but pushing maybe towards more grass-fed livestock industry, but eggs and fish, more fruits and vegetables, and protein-rich plants and whole grains. So in that, they ran sort of 3 scenarios. One was sort of keeping things the status quo. The next one would be omnivore's delight, which was kind of a balanced diet in between, and that's the one that the plan really kind of hinges on. And then regional reliance, which is sort of more geared on more of maybe a slightly emergency situation or sort of less access to food from other places. Because again, none of this is assuming that we won't be getting certain other foods from other regions. They used the what was then the healthy plate, Michelle Obama's healthy plate image, and then Harvard School of Public Health, they had their own healthy plate at the time as well. And I don't actually know if this administration has updated our nutritional guidelines back to ketchup being a vegetable, for those of you who are old enough to remember those days. But in order to get to omnivore's delight, we'd have whole farm production. And then there's a whole fisheries piece that I'm not going to get into. Because currently only about 5% of the agricultural landscape in the region is used for food production. And most of it sort of indirectly because dairy is such a big industry in the region. And so it means that we would really triple the amount of land that was in agriculture. But to do that, and this is where, I'm always pretty sensitive, because if climate change is this thing that we all have to deal with, you don't want to be tearing down New England forests in order to grow food. You need to find a healthy balance. And so it's a very kind of cautious approach to it, and our New England director is looking into what that would look like using some of the mapping that we're doing so that you could do that. You could use, sort of looking at marginal land that's grown to scrub. You could look at sort of very new growth forest, and what you would do is make sure that you brought land into production that was not sacrificing the quality of our forest resources. Look into extending the growing season, so people are probably familiar with hoop houses and that kind of thing. And then increasing sustainable fishing and fisheries, which I think is a really major advantage that we have, especially for people living in coastal communities. One of the reasons I think the challenge is so great, and this is also one of the maps that we have done at AFT, is when you look at bird's eye view at New England, it looks like we don't have agriculture, which I keep trying to explain to our New England director. Well, we really do. It just doesn't look that way at this scale because so much of it is forested. And 80% of our landscape is forested. And so therefore, finding that healthy balance of how to move forward without sacrificing our forest resources but increasing food production becomes a really important environmental challenge as well as a food security challenge. So Food Solutions New England, or FSNE, right, is kind of the path to how we start to move forward on the things in the vision. And the vision identified sort of 3 challenges: limited land base, which I've talked about quite a bit, limited processing facilities. I've been on individual farms in California that have more infrastructure to cool, wash, pack produce than we have in the entire region. So, that is something that we really have to look at, is what is the infrastructure that we need to move forward with the vision, as well as the infrastructure of land and natural resources. And then pricing. I mean, we just have a lot of competition from other regions that have more land, have more people farming, have longer growing seasons. They have definite competitive advantages, and not all of them are even in this country. So if we're really going to compete, we have to find a way, I think, to build a lot of consumer support and find new ways of approaching agriculture. That said, we have plenty of water when we're not flooding. We have a lot of consumers, and most farms are relatively near to consumers. And there is this increasing interest in sustainable agriculture, getting into agriculture and food system. So the network, was formed to bring very diverse groups of people, institutions, and individuals together to move forward on achieving the vision. It's very, at this point, very process-oriented. And so I sort of love this quote that it's a collection of relationships built one conversation or one project at a time. So it's not that there's this sort of think tank in a room and we're like, these are the 3 best things we're going to do and we're going to go out and solve all the problems. It doesn't work that way. It's really people building relationships and trying to figure out if you're working in rural Maine with a very agricultural community and you're trying to solve food security in an African American community in Bridgeport, how do you build the relationships in order to make that kind of relationship, sort of economic relationship, happen? So the idea is that we'll all work together and sort of strengthen our economy, but really a values-based kind of approach to democracy, equity, justice, and sustainability. The idea right now is a lot of work around building those values and shared values in order to get to the more production-oriented things. And so I love this image because this is kind of how it feels to be part of the network. We're definitely not moving forward in a linear sort of way. There are a lot of people trying to figure out what is their piece and how do we put it together to build a larger whole, really keeping the values of the group in mind. But the main strategies, and we do have sort of 3 main work groups, I would say. One is called the New Narrative Group, and working with consultants to understand the way people in the region, first of all, see New England as a region, or do people really see it as a state by state by state thing? Creating a regional identity is not something that most people or places do, especially a 6-state, multi-state regional identity. So they've been doing a lot of interviewing to sort of figure out what people already think, what the sort of current existing narrative is around the food system, and how much it actually relates to what's happening in New England. And then they're going to be coming out with a whole sort of media kit, I guess, or sort of communications kit for all of the people to start working with, to start telling the story of the agriculture we really have and the agriculture we really want to see, or the food system broadly that we really want to see. The group that I'm working with, not surprisingly because I'm kind of a data nerd, it's called SONAF, or the State of the New England Food System. And originally that was supposed to be kind of a report. I sort of think the food vision already is that kind of report. And what we've been thinking about more are sort of metrics and indicators and creating a dashboard and something much more interactive and probably on the web that people can use. It may then result in a physical report as well. But I think that from the people we've been talking to, people are more interested in sort of what's going up, what's going down, what's staying the same, and trying to figure out what are the metrics to evaluate not only the production goals, but also some of the values propositions. And then there's a policy group. How many people here know what the Farm Bill is? Good. So we have a few people who know what the Farm Bill is. So it's this huge, comprehensive piece of legislation that primarily addresses food and food insecurity, even though it's called the Farm Bill, but also addresses agriculture and conservation and rural development. The idea of sort of a regional fish, farm, and food policy is something probably as comprehensive that really puts together kind of a package of different things that have to do with environmental sustainability, economic viability, farming, fishing, and the kind of policies that would be needed across the region to support the food vision. So folks are working on sort of what that platform would look like, and then we'll be creating kind of a citizen's guide so that we can help people go out in their communities at both the local level within your own municipalities, since we don't really have strong counties here in New England, certainly not in Massachusetts, but sort of in your own municipality, but also statewide to move the vision forward. And then the sort of organizing group of FS&E does strategic convenings and sort of network development and sort of, bringing us together for meetings and figuring out how to move us forward so we actually get something done. So I will just end by saying there's much work to do, but building a community that knows its own story, so that's the narrative, grows its leadership, and is committed to justice is the only way we'll truly get where we're going. Questions? Yeah.
Hi. I think the food vision is wonderful. It's such an aspirational document, and I refer to it all the time. I just love it. But I worry that how it will be implemented if each state isn't on board as a state, each state hasn't made a commitment, and which also just brings me to the point that it's just shocking that we don't actually have food planning in this country. The farm bill is supposed to say we have to plan, but nobody's
working on it.
Nobody's looking out to see that we're going to have enough food, and I don't think everybody really gets that. And this was an effort by nonprofit organizations and individual experts to try to do that, but there's no how,
No, I agree. I mean, I think that, where you see a lot of the action coming is actually from the bottom up. So you see regional planning organizations or municipal planning organizations or even individual planning organizations doing it. But you're right, state policy by and large has not gotten to this point. So I agree. It is something that, I have a planning degree, so I've been trying to get this going for, I guess I won't retire because it's going to still take some more time. But I'd be happy to talk, definitely check out the Growing Food Connections website because we did a lot of research. And you're right. I mean, most people, planners don't even think about planning for food or planning for farms. It's just a very new concept to them. But it is now at least a concept. So we have a seed, and so we need to water it and cultivate it. Yeah. And I'd be happy to talk to you after. Yeah. Yeah.
Does the plan include things like dual-use solar farms? Not just pave farms with solar panels, but mount them up high and require agriculture to continue underneath?
Yeah. I wouldn't say the vision really does. It talks more broadly about sort of sustainability and things being energy efficient, but that's an issue that we at AFT are really paying a lot of attention to in the region, but also in the Mid-Atlantic and other places, and trying to come up with, we actually have a whole sort of we have a climate change initiative, and in that is a big solar siting initiative. So again, I'd be happy to connect you to the people who are, but our New England director is really involved in that, and we have national staff involved with that, because it really is a problem. And it's too bad that it's a problem, because it's not going to be that long until they're going to find other ways to do photovoltaics that won't require taking away prime farmland. But right now, I'm on my local conservation commission, so there's this do you cite it on wetlands? No. Do you cite it on prime farmland? No. But we do want solar. So so those are really, really important conversations, because we should be able to have it. I think we should be able to have it all if we had better planning. And that, to me, in Massachusetts is actually a huge problem, is I don't think we have very good planning in Massachusetts. But
I think it's a better idea to put solar panels on wetlands than it is on farmlands.
Yeah, and if you do it on farmland, make sure you don't take much land when you put in the stake, and you put them high enough that you can put stuff underneath it, right? So you could graze animals underneath it, but don't, but it really just means that people who are making planning decisions should understand the natural resources and the benefits of wetlands and farmland, as well as whatever their immediate goal is. Planners are supposed to be good, comprehensive thinkers, but I know. In the back?
Yes. Thank you for coming. With the school paper here, I want to follow up on the question that this woman asked earlier. Can New England improve the financial situation of its small farmers at this point, realistically, without state or government support to get the ball rolling?
Well, sure. I mean, consumers have a big role to play, right? It's just hard. I think, when people make decisions about how much they're willing to pay for food, and you're competing with areas that can bring in food much cheaper, a lot of people have a harder time paying more money maybe for something that seems more expensive, at least immediately. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot we can do. I think that by building processing and making investment, I think the gentleman who was talking about hemp before, working with our land grant institutions to invest in sort of the agriculture of tomorrow and to be forward thinking will help improve economics for agriculture, you know. I think that if people who are growing leafy greens had a really good place to cool and wash and pack and store and all of that stuff, if we had that infrastructure, which you can get with private investment as well as public investment, I think you can do it. That said, I think public investment and public support are really, really important, and I wouldn't want to not use the public sector as well. And, you know, I think this current farm bill was hard fought, and it took a long time to get it passed. But there are some good things. There's still money for, you know, the value-added producer grants and stuff like that. So there definitely are pots of money you can go to in the public sector as well. I think it's going to take everything. I think it's going to take all of us to really, and that's why I think having a vision is so important. If it's a shared vision and we all want to work towards it, then we can get it done. Yeah.
One thing we were talking about a little earlier today and also last week was thinking about livestock in the food system, and just curious if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the vision for livestock sustainably being incorporated in our future food system.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing in New England. I think it's you know, why I find the omnivore's delight idea appealing is that it isn't eliminating livestock. You know, especially if we shift much more to a grass-based livestock systems, we're not going to be eating grass. And so if there's land that's more suitable for grazing, and we raise livestock in a way that's both humane and appropriate for that kind of system, then livestock has a role. You always have to balance, you know, the environmental and the economic and the public health. And so livestock often gets caught in the crossfire. Right now, livestock's getting a really bad rap from a lot of people looking at climate change. But the reports that I've read aren't very nuanced, and so that's another thing that we actually really want to study, is what are the kinds of livestock systems that make sense, that are not bad for climate, that can be part of, you know, we really, at AFT, we really want an aspirational vision of how can agriculture actually enhance the environment. So instead of always thinking of how can agriculture do less harm, how do we think of creating agricultural systems that actually work with nature to make the environment healthier? And so what's the role of livestock in that? And in rangeland management, there is a real role for livestock, but it certainly won't be the kind of intensive, you know, grain-based, crowded systems, I think, that we have today. And I think that, you know, a lot of people are looking at how you have sort of a lighter meat diet or other kinds of meats. And there are a lot of meats that people used to eat that nobody eats anymore. When I first moved to the Valley, everywhere I went there were signs that said meat pets. And I had no idea what that meant. And then I realized it was rabbits. And people were, like a lot of people, were eating rabbits, but they were also selling rabbits for 4-H and for kids to raise as pets. That's a whole other kind of system that we've completely forgotten. But when you're thinking about how to actually have a more resilient regional food system, we may be looking at other kinds of meat options. And that's not in the food vision. That's just me. But I just remember coming here and being like, what is a meat pet? You know, like I had no idea. But it's, you know, that's a big part of a lot of people's diets.
All right. If there are no more questions from the group, perhaps I think our speaker will stay for a few minutes afterwards if you'd like to come up individually. Otherwise, thank you for coming. Thank you very much for taking